In this video, we lay out the basic reasons that most New Testament scholars that think that Paul is speaking as another character in Romans chapter 7. I'd say from the outset that there are some New Testament scholars, my estimate would be somewhere around 30 to 40%, that think Paul is speaking in his own voice here, his own experience with sin, either in the past or in the present. But the majority of New Testament scholars think that Paul is using a rhetorical device called speech and character. So I'm going to lay out the basic reasons that most New Testament scholars, myself included, think that Paul is speaking as another character here. And then I'm going to lay out the two main options for the type of character that Paul might be speaking as in Romans chapter 7. So I am going to go away. I'm going to remove myself from the screen in order so that you can see Romans chapter 7 and then also into Romans chapter 8, the first two verses here. If you have a printed Bible handy, I encourage you to look at it or to pull up another tab if the text that I have reproduced here is too small for you. It very well may be, because I'm going to ask you to do a lecture pause here in just 1 second once I make the screen bigger. And then I'm going to ask you to go ahead and count how many I's, me's, and my's you find in the text. That is, how many first person singulars do you find in Romans chapter 7 and down into Romans chapter 8? Right, now that you've come back, that may have taken you a little while because there are quite a few. By my count, we have about 45, and there's sort of variance between different English translations based on how they render different forms of the Greek, but somewhere around 45. And the point here is that this is far more than Paul uses anywhere else in the book of Romans. That normally Paul is using second person plural pronouns. He's addressing y'all. There are times when he speaks in the first person singulars in his own voice, but it is not all that common. It is much. The sheer number here is quite a bit. And so the question is that Paul really speaking as his own I? Is Paul the I, or is someone else the I? So the basic tenet of the speech and character theory is that the I here is not Paul. And there are a few reasons that that people think that it might not be Paul. And the first is that we get this shift in voice that especially happens at Romans 7, verse 7, that you can see Paul sort of moving from addressing the audience to doing something else entirely. So we get this sort of clear shift at Romans 7:7. And we also get this comment that Paul says, I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came in, sin revived. And so scholars are going to look at this and say Paul never actually lived apart from the law. From the time Paul was born, of course, he knew the Jewish law, as Paul celebrates being born and raised a Jew, circumcised on the 8th day. So from the very beginning of his life, Paul knows the law. There is never a time when Paul was alive apart from the law. So this seems to signal to scholars that Paul is talking as someone else who has this experience of being alive and living some amount of time without the law coming in, without knowledge of the law, or without feeling obligation to the law. And then down here in Romans 8:2, Paul uses a second person singular, a you, not a y'all. So sort of it looks like someone else is speaking from 7:7 down to 7:25 and maybe even into 8:1. And then Paul resumes his voice and sort of assures this person of something. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set you, individual you, free from the law of sin and death. Not y'all, which is what he normally uses. Second person plurals are most abundant in the book of Romans. So Paul sort of turns to this individual after their speech and assures them of a particular truth, namely that the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set you, singular, free from the law of sin and death. So the basic tenets of a speech and character is speaking as someone else, as another character, an individual known character, either from literary past or from the rhetorical present, and a character type that the audience might have been familiar with. And we've seen Paul use rhetorical devices elsewhere in Romans chapters 2 and 3. He uses diatribe, either he's speaking to and with other characters, so he's addressing other characters in Romans chapter 2. He has a dialogue in Romans chapter 3. We've seen that there's sort of a back and forth where Paul is speaking, another person is speaking as sort of a rhetorical and pedagogical technique. And now, according to the speech and character theory, what Paul does in Romans chapter 7 is speak as another character. So it's sort of like taking that diatribe, speaking with another character, but entering into the other character for a more extended period of time. And there are sort of two most viable options in my mind to who this other character might be. The first option, and this would sort of continue the diatribe from Romans chapter 2 and 3, one of the options for who Paul is engaging in those chapters is a Gentile who calls themselves a Jew. So if that sort of line of thinking is continued, this I might be a Gentile who calls themselves a Jew, but is finding it really hard to follow the Torah. They sort of just can't do it. And this is a Jewish stereotype in Second Temple Judaism, that Gentiles, non-Jews, just simply don't have the ability to do the things of Torah. We see this sort of reflected in that decline of civilizations narrative in Romans chapter 1, where the Gentiles do all this terrible, awful stuff, if it is in fact the Gentiles that are primarily in mind in Romans 1, 18 through 32. So it might be that Paul is speaking as a Gentile who is having trouble following Torah. And so some of the reasons for this here, we have this bit about of the character saying, not the character yet in Romans 5. While we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions, aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. So Paul's sort of introducing this idea of Gentiles living in sinful flesh, in passion, sort of hearkening back to Romans 1, 18 through 32, where we get this whole bit about the Gentiles being sinful. And then the law coming in, so this makes sense of one being alive apart from the law, having an experience of living apart from the law, and then the law coming in when they begin to call themselves a Jew, when they sort of convert to Judaism or convert to being a God-fearer, the law comes in, and then they have this struggle with keeping the law. So Gentiles had a time when they lived apart from the law. And we get more of this in 7:14 through 20, this bit about Gentiles being sinful, sort of this struggle. If Gentiles are by nature unable to keep the law because of their sort of sinful nature, and then this makes a whole lot of sense of this struggle, this internal struggle that is depicted by the character, beginning especially at verse 14. But Paul then, when Paul resumes his voice and addresses this character, he lets them know that there is a change in circumstances. So despite their experience of trying to follow Torah and being unable to, sort of there is a better way for Gentiles to live in the sort of new apocalyptic revealed now that is in Christ Jesus. The other main option, and I would say that this is sort of a more well favored, or there are a larger percent of New Testament scholars who think that Paul has Genesis chapters 1 through 3, and especially Genesis chapter 3 in mind here, and especially particularly the character of Adam. We've talked previously in this class about the figure of Adam in Second Temple Judaism, that sort of other Jews also talked about Adam. Paul in Romans chapter 5 has already evoked Adam. So it could be that Paul is sort of returning to the intertexts of Genesis chapter 3 and sort of bringing Adam onto the stage to speak as a speech in character. So we have this bit about bearing fruit for God, sort of the language of fruit seems to be an echo, probably not an allusion or a quotation or a citation, but an echo of the Genesis narrative, where, of course, Adam and Eve eat of the fruit and things do not go well for them because they do so. Adam also has the experience of living apart from the commandment. So, as the first created human, there is a time in which Adam has not been commanded. One, Adam doesn't have Torah, the law, insofar as Torah, the law, comes later with Moses. But there's also a time in which Adam does not have the particular commandment of not eating from a particular tree. But then that commandment comes in, and then things go wrong, insofar as Adam and Eve actually do eat from the fruit. And then so Paul as Adam says, "For sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, deceived me and through it killed me." And here we sort of seem to have an echo, if not an allusion, to Genesis chapter 3:13, wherein the writer of Genesis says, "The serpent deceived me and I ate." So this particular language of deception and then a result from that deception. In Romans chapter 7, it's deceiving and killing. In Genesis chapter 3, it's deceiving and eating, which in Second Temple Jewish tradition ultimately is what leads to Adam and Eve's dying. That sin and death, mortality, come into the world because of their actions. We had this bit of fleshliness emphasized and a body of death, and in 14 really down through 22. And what this sort of, again, it sort of harkens back to Second Temple Jewish traditions about Adam that really associated Adam and Eve's action in the garden with sin, death, and flesh. Sort of there's this constellation of these terms that tend to show up around Adam when Second Temple Jewish authors talk about Adam or when they write about Adam. And this is also the case in Romans chapter 5. So if you turn back to Romans chapter 5 and sort of look at the kinds of terms that show up in that chapter with respect to Adam, we have things like sin, death, flesh, and transgression. The same kind of terms that we have here. So scholars are going to sort of look at these constellation of terms, this echo of Genesis chapter 3 with respect to the serpent deceived me and I ate, and the bearing fruit, and the fact that Adam and Eve live apart from the commandment. And they're going to say this sounds a whole lot like Adam. Adam makes sense of what Paul is saying here. I agree that there is much in Romans chapter 7 that sounds a whole lot like Genesis chapter 3, and it particularly sounds like what Second Temple Jews say and write when they are engaging Genesis chapter 3. But what we'll do in the next video is I will actually make the case that it is not Adam that is speaking in Romans chapter 7, but it's Eve that is speaking in Romans chapter 7. And I'm going to start in this video, sort of, and to segue to the next one, this bit in Genesis 3:13, this quotation, "The serpent deceived me and I ate," this is not Adam speaking. This is a direct quote from Eve, which makes it more likely that Paul has Eve in mind in this particular chapter than it is that he has Adam in mind in